Hey, this is Real Talk, and this series we talk about psychology. We talk about the ideas that have influenced human society, where did they come from, who were the forerunners that brought these ideas into existence, and how does psychology influence your life. But first of all, before we even go a step further, let's look at what the word in itself, psychology, means. So the term psychology comes from the old Latin and Greek logia, which is the study of, and psyche, the Greek and Latin term psyche, which means soul, mind, or spirit. So literally, on a linguistic level, when we're talking about psychology, we're talking about the study of the mind, the soul, or the spirit. However, in modern times, psychology has evolved and turned more into the study, the scientific study of human thought, human behavior, human actions, more importantly, how humans interact in given circumstances, whether as individuals or as part of a group. Now, psychology originally wasn't its own academic discipline. It was originally just a branch of philosophy, and it wasn't until in the late 1800s that it started to take shape and become part of its own discipline. This is why to this day, when psychologists have inquiry or have questions that they don't seem to be able to get to the root of, what do? They refer back to what they call the mother discipline to try and attempt to answer those questions. What do psychologists do? They do a number of things. Research is one field, but also you have psychologists that work or that practice in, say, for example, healthcare. So they're psychologists that develop ideas of clinical psychology and psychotherapy and counseling, what you call talking therapy, to help people with various conditions, what they call in the textbook atypical psychology. So looking at various conditions like depression, and they explore what's the difference between bipolar, what's the difference between mild depression, moderate depression, what is the best form of treatment. Does it need to be medication, or can it be talking therapy alone, or by reading a self-help book and practicing certain self-help exercises? Or you have psychologists that work in the field of politics. Many people wouldn't know this, but whether it's in the White House or in number 10, there are psychologists or people who at least have studied to at least a level of master degree. It's psychology, so they help to shape the ideas and how to help leaders influence on a mass level. So this is when we get into the idea of the psychology of persuasion. You have psychologists that work in marketing. You have psychologists that work in sports. There is a new science, relatively new, which is known as sports psychology. But as they say in philosophy, sometimes a thing exists, phenomena exists before we give it a name. So if we go back to the 1960s, there was no real literature that dealt with sports psychology. But if we think of one famous iconic individual from the 1960s, we think of Cassius Clay, Muhammad Ali, aka Muhammad Ali. And if you look at his life as a sportsman, he employed an individual by the name of Boudini Brown, who really, for those who follow the sport of boxing, and we're just using this as an example now, they said that Boudini Brown was in his corner, but he had no real knowledge of the sport of boxing particularly. But what he was a motivation, an individual that motivated Muhammad Ali, and they had a banter and they had a type of interplay that helped for him, enabled Muhammad Ali to stay motivated, to stay at his sharpest, because the sport of boxing, for example, it involves a lot of routine to ritual, doing the same thing over and over and over. And this can be mind-numbing at times. And many people cut corners and they suffer the consequences in the ring. But Muhammad Ali employed this man, and he used a form of what you could call a kind of forerunner, a kind of prototype sports psychology to do with motivation. Also, looking at the same individual, you could say that he used psychological warfare on his opponents by demeaning them, by speaking in in a pejorative term about them, and speaking himself up. It had two influences. One, it would help to create self-doubt in the individual, but also it put himself under pressure that he had to perform at the highest level. So this is again different ways of the individual motivating themselves. Now, what we're saying is that in this series, we will be looking at things like personality or character. What are the traits in personality? What are the different models of personality? You have, for example, the Enneagram and the 9 types of personalities that exist. Or more famously, we have the one put forward by Carl Jung. We talk about introvert, extrovert, people who feel, people who think, people who are intuitive, and people who are internal in terms of how they come to their decisions as opposed to taking external information. We look at memory in this series also, and the disorders that come with memory. What is memory? When we're talking about memory, we're talking about being able to first encode information, store information, and recall information. The researchers say that our memory, the human memory, is something like the equivalent of, in terms of our long-term memory, something like 250 million gigabytes, which is something like 300 years of TV programming. We look at the psychology of persuasion, of the different stages or the different factors that help people who work in the field of sales, people who work in politics, people who work in influence, the different models of factors that tried and tested methods of how people are influenced. We look at the psychology of prejudice. What is it about prejudice, whether it be race, whether it be class-based, whether it be gender-based, but there are certain psychological traits and different schools of thought or theories related to why people are prejudiced. We look at conditions like BBD. What is BBD? Body dysmorphic disorder, or body dysmorphia more popularly called. Why this happens, what type of people this happens to, and are there treatments, chemical and non-chemical treatments for this condition. We look at also the psychology of success. What is it about those people who are winners? Is this something that is innate? Are we born to be successful? Or are there a series of formulas that anybody can employ to improve the outcome of the intended goals that they attempt to strive for? And we look at the difference between male and female, gender. Is there a difference between the psychology of men and women? Is this innate? Is it biological? Is it physiological? Or is it related to the culture that a person is grown up in, and the type of the way that the significant carers have imparted information? Is it social learning theory? Is it nature? Is it nurture? There are also a number of key individuals we may be touching on aspects of their work. We can't get away from the famous work of Sigmund Freud and his psychodynamic or psychoanalytic theories, the stages of development. We look at the work of Dr. Albert Ellis and his rational emotive behavior theory. We look at the work of Skinner, we look at the work of Maslow, we look at the work of Carl Rogers. Let's just take, for example, Carl Rogers. He was a humanistic psychologist, or a person-centered psychologist, or what they would call in those days a client-centered psychologist. His theory was revolutionary in the 1960s when he came about. There were different schools. That were the psychodynamic school was quite dominant. The behavioral school was quite dominant. There was these different schools of psychology and how to treat emotional and psychological malady. But what Mr. Rogers was able to do was to learn from the philosophy of the Far East and his own Protestant upbringing, and combined some of the ideas that he had read and come into contact with, and he came up with his idea of the person-centered school of psychology or counseling. And what he suggested, or what he put forward, was the idea that human beings are automatically or inherently have the constituents to grow to be healthy, to grow to be goal accomplishing, or arrive at the destination that is fulfilling in their lives. But sometimes they encounter difficulties, but the inherent nature is to pull them to grow towards the best, the thing that is best for them. However, what what Mr. Rogers said, Carl Rogers said, was that when there's a problem, all you need to do is to bring about 3 conditions for the person to grow, for the person to heal, for the person to excel. And they are what are called the core conditions. He said that they need to experience empathy, that somebody, if that is a counselor, if that is a peer, if that is somebody that gives them some support, it could even be from a group, but they need to feel understood. So the empathy is key. They need to also feel a sense of not being judged. So there's a kind of unconditional positive regard, which the therapist, the group, the individual, the person, the mentor is to add to the person or demonstrate in their encounter with the person who is going through difficulties, and that person, that group, that individual, that role model or counselor should employ a level of being congruent, being genuine, not holding on to a professional facade or being false, but being real and being in the moment and being present with that person. And as long as those core conditions exist, then psychological transformation can take place. But like I said before, psychologists, they do research. Psychologists, they put together very, very complex ideas and explore the parts of the human journey, parts of human thought, parts of human behavior, which allows us to get to our, as they say, next level. But this is just an introduction, and I look forward to seeing you next time for another edition of Real Talk. But until then, catch you later.